There is a version of this story that is neat, tidy, and safe. It is the version printed in the textbooks authorized by the Tudor dynasty, repeated by centuries of historians who valued stability over the messy, uncomfortable truth. In this official narrative, a delusional young man named Perkin Warbeck, the son of a French boatman, put on a costume and tried to steal a crown that didn't belong to him. We are told he was a fraud, a puppet, a momentary nuisance that was easily swatted aside by the righteous King Henry VII. But when you look at the raw correspondence from the late 15th century, that tidy narrative begins to dissolve. The official records suggest he was a nobody, yet for 8 years this nobody was treated as a sovereign king by the courts of France, Scotland, and the Holy Roman Empire. Monarchs do not bow to boatmen. Emperors do not marry their cousins to common fraudsters. The historical consensus calls him an imposter, but the behavior of the most powerful people in Europe suggests they saw something else entirely. We are asked to believe that the entire world was fooled by a teenager, or that they were all collectively lying for a decade. The truth is likely far more complex and far more dangerous to the established order of the British monarchy. You're watching Empire Unknown, where the silence speaks. If you value this depth of analysis, subscribing ensures you don't miss the next investigation. To understand the sheer scale of this crisis, we have to strip away the inevitability of the Tudor dynasty. Today we view the Tudors as the immutable bedrock of English history, Henry VII, Elizabeth I, the Golden Age. But in 1491, the name Tudor was not a legend. It was a precarious, fragile experiment. Henry VII was a usurper. He had seized the throne at the Battle of Bosworth Field only 6 years prior, ending the Plantagenet line by killing Richard III. His claim to the throne was incredibly weak, stitched together through distant ancestry and the right of conquest. He was a king constantly looking over his shoulder, ruling a kingdom that was exhausted by 30 years of civil war, yet still deeply loyal to the memory of the House of York. The atmosphere in London was one of suffocating paranoia. Henry knew that his crown was borrowed. He knew that as long as a legitimate male heir of the House of York lived, he was nothing more than a placeholder. And this is where the ghost story begins. The legitimacy of the Tudor reign rested entirely on the assumption that the rightful heirs, the 2 young princes in the Tower, Edward V and his brother Richard, Duke of York, were dead. They had vanished into the Tower of London in 1483, never to be seen again. Henry needed them to be dead. The country assumed they were dead, but there were no bodies, there was no funeral, there was only silence and a vacuum of power, and in the volatile landscape of medieval politics, a vacuum is an invitation. It was into this vacuum in the autumn of 1491 that a merchant ship from Brittany docked in the port of Cork on the southern coast of Ireland. Ireland was, at this time, a wild frontier for the English Crown territory that was technically under English rule but spiritually and politically aligned with the old House of York. It was a place where rebels went to breathe. A young man stepped off that ship. He was 17 years old, perhaps 18. By all accounts, he was exceptionally handsome, possessing a natural grace and a courtly bearing that seemed impossible for a common merchant's assistant. He was dressed in silk, fine, uncut silk that caught the light and the attention of the locals. He didn't walk like a sailor, he walked like someone who expected doors to open for him. The people of Cork were starving for a return to the old ways. They looked at this young man with his high cheekbones and his confident gaze, and they began to project their hopes onto him. They didn't see a stranger, they saw a savior. Rumors began to circulate through the taverns and the marketplaces almost immediately. First, they whispered that he was the Earl of Warwick, another imprisoned claimant. The young man denied it. Then they whispered he was a bastard son of Richard III. Again, he denied it. He claimed he was merely a silk merchant named Pierre or Perkin. But the crowd in Cork would not accept mediocrity. They needed a king. The Yorkist lords of Ireland, men who had lost power and prestige under the new Tudor regime, approached him with a dangerous proposition. They looked him in the eye and asked him the question that would ignite a decade of war. They asked if he was Richard of Shrewsbury, the Duke of York, the younger of the 2 princes in the Tower. They asked if he had escaped the assassins, fled England, and was now returning to claim his birthright. This is the moment where history splinters. If the young man was a fraud, this was the moment he decided to commit to a lie so massive it would require his death to undo. If he was telling the truth, this was the moment he finally felt safe enough to reveal his identity. He looked at the Irish lords and he said yes. He told them he was indeed Richard, Duke of York. He claimed that his brother Edward had been murdered in the Tower, but that he had been spared by a merciful assassin and smuggled to the continent, forced to live in hiding, wandering Europe, waiting for the moment to return. The story was perfect, it was tragic, it was plausible, and most importantly, it was unverifiable. In an age without DNA testing or photography, identity was a performance. If you looked like a king, spoke like a king, and wore the clothes of a king, you were halfway to the throne. And this young man performed the role with a terrifying perfection. He knew the details of court life. He spoke with the correct accent. He bore a striking physical resemblance to Edward IV, the man he claimed was his father. News of this resurrection traveled across the Irish Sea with frightening speed. In London, King Henry VII received the intelligence reports with a cold dread. He had spent years trying to secure his dynasty, marrying Elizabeth of York to unite the warring houses, trying to bury the ghosts of the past. And now, the past had literally walked out of the grave and landed in Ireland. Henry publicly dismissed the claim as ridiculous, branding the boy a feigned lad, a lowborn impostor named Perkin Warbeck. He released official statements detailing Warbeck's supposed real family in Tournai, creating a paper trail to discredit the threat. But privately, the king was terrified. He knew that the truth didn't matter as much as the asterisk belief. If the people believed this boy was Richard, the Tudor reign was over. Legitimacy is a collective hallucination. It only works if everyone agrees on who wears the crown. Henry began to mobilize his spy network, the most sophisticated intelligence apparatus in Europe, to track every move of this young pretender. He locked down the ports. He interrogated anyone who had even whispered the name of the House of York. Meanwhile, the young man in Ireland was no longer just a curiosity. He was becoming a geopolitical weapon. The King of France, Charles VI, saw an opportunity to destabilize his English rival. He invited the young man to Paris. This was the first major domino. By accepting him at the French court, Charles VI was officially recognizing his claim. The young man traveled to France, where he was greeted not as a merchant, but as a prince of the blood. He was given a guard of honor. He was addressed as Your Grace. This was the transformation. In the opulent halls of the French court, the young man shed the last remnants of Perkin Warbeck and fully inhabited the skin of Richard, Duke of York. He began to issue proclamations. He wrote letters to the monarchs of Europe, signing them with the florid, confident signature of a king. He wasn't just acting, he was ruling a court in exile. However, the true test of his legitimacy, or the true height of the conspiracy, was yet to come. The Treaty of Etaples eventually forced the French king to expel him to maintain peace with England. The young man needed a new sanctuary. He turned his eyes toward the one place where the House of York still lived and breathed, the court of Margaret of Burgundy. Margaret was the sister of the late King Edward IV. She was the aunt of the missing princes. She was a woman of immense power, wealth, and a burning, vitriolic hatred for Henry VI. She was the matriarch of the Yorkist cause. If anyone could expose a fraud, it was her. She knew her nephews intimately. She knew their mannerisms, their memories, the way they spoke. If this young man walked into her court and she rejected him, the game was over. He would be exposed as a liar before the world. He arrived in the Low Countries anxious and exposed. He was brought before the Duchess Margaret. The court held its breath. This was the forensic examination of the century. Margaret studied his face. She questioned him on intimate family details, memories of Christmas at Westminster, the specific layout of the royal apartments, nicknames, childhood illnesses. And then, according to the records, she wept. She embraced him, crying out that he was her lost nephew, the White Rose of York. She validated him completely. She gave him money, soldiers, and a platform. With Margaret's endorsement, the skepticism of Europe evaporated. If the aunt recognized the nephew, who was Henry Tudor to say otherwise? The conspiracy had now hardened into a spear, pointed directly at the heart of London. But to view this merely as a family reunion is to miss the darker mechanics at play. The official chronicles dismiss this era as the delusions of a young man, yet the archives reveal a coordinated dismantling of the Tudor narrative, funded by the deepest pockets in Christendom. What we are seeing is not just a pretender seeking a crown, but the weaponization of identity by Europe's superpowers. The boy from Tournai had ceased to exist. In his place stood a geopolitical asset capable of bringing the English monarchy to its knees. The news of a surviving Prince of York did not just trickle across the Channel. It exploded into the courts of Europe. Charles VI of France, locked in his own diplomatic chess match with Henry Tudor over the independence of Brittany, saw an opportunity too perfect to ignore. He invited the young man to Paris, not as a curiosity, but as a sovereign. When Perkin Warbeck arrived at the French court, he was greeted with the full ceremonial pomp reserved for a visiting head of state. He was assigned a personal guard of 100 men, commanded by a French noble. The court addressed him as the Duke of York. For a brief, intoxicating window, the deception was absolute. This was the moment the conspiracy transcended a simple lie. It became international policy. Henry VI, a king plagued by the insecurity of his own usurpation, understood the threat immediately. He knew that legitimacy is often just a matter of who is willing to back your claim. If France, the ancient enemy, recognized this boy as King Richard IV, Henry's own treaty alliances would crumble. The Tudor response was swift and desperate. Henry essentially bribed the French king to expel the pretender, signing the Treaty of Etaples in 1492. He paid a massive indemnity, hard gold, to buy the silence of his rival. Warbeck was cast out of France, but this expulsion was in itself a validation. You do not pay a fortune to banish a peasant, you pay it to banish a rival king. By forcing Henry's hand, Warbeck had proven his worth as a destabilizing agent. He retreated back to the safety of Margaret of Burgundy, but the momentum had already shifted. The Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I was the next to step onto the board. Maximilian was a man of grandiose ambition and deep grudges. He loathed the Tudors and saw in Warbeck a magnificent tool to humiliate Henry. He invited the young man to Vienna, and later to the funeral of his father, Emperor Frederick III. There, amidst the somber pageantry of the gathered European elite, Warbeck walked in the procession as a royal prince. Maximilian formally recognized him as the rightful king of England. The psychological impact of this cannot be overstated. The Holy Roman Emperor was the highest secular authority in Christendom. His endorsement was not just political support, it was a divine mandate. Back in London, the atmosphere was suffocating. Henry VII was no longer fighting a ghost. He was fighting a shadow government that was rapidly gaining substance. The king's paranoia, usually a simmering background noise, boiled over into a reign of terror. He understood that an invasion from the outside could be repelled, but rot from the inside was fatal. He unleashed his spymaster, Sir Edward Poynings, and a vast network of informers to infiltrate the conspiracy. They didn't just watch the ports, they watched the nobility. Henry knew that for Warbeck to succeed, he needed English allies, men inside the Tudor court who were secretly waiting for the white rose to bloom again. The king's agents began to intercept letters, bribe couriers, and turn conspirators. What they found was terrifying. The conspiracy had reached into the very heart of the royal household. The investigation led to a name that shook the foundations of the Tudor regime, Sir William Stanley. This was not some minor disgruntled lord. Stanley was the Lord Chamberlain, the man who controlled access to the king's private chambers. More importantly, he was the man whose intervention at the Battle of Bosworth had placed the crown on Henry's head. Stanley was the architect of the Tudor dynasty, and yet when confronted with the evidence, a statement where he reportedly said that if the young man was indeed the son of Edward IV, he would never take up arms against him, Henry was paralyzed. If you appreciate the meticulous work required to reconstruct these forgotten betrayals from fragmented archives, liking this video helps signal that there is a demand for history that refuses to stay buried. The betrayal of William Stanley broke something in Henry VII. It confirmed his deepest fear, that loyalty in England was transactional. If the man who made him king was willing to hedge his bets on a resurrected ghost, then no one was safe. In 1495, Stanley was executed. The message was brutal and clear: past service bought no immunity. The blood of the Lord Chamberlain washed away any lingering romanticism about the War of the Roses. This was survival. But while Henry was purging his court, Warbeck was preparing for war. The support of Burgundy and the Empire had provided him with ships and mercenaries. In July 1495, the Pretender's fleet appeared off the coast of Kent near Deal. This was the moment of truth. The theory was that the English people, groaning under Tudor taxes and nostalgic for the House of York, would rise up to greet their returning prince. They did not. When Warbeck's advance party landed, the locals didn't cheer, they attacked. The men of Kent, loyal to the stability Henry had brought or perhaps just weary of endless war, fell upon the mercenaries. It was a slaughter. Warbeck, watching from his flagship, made a decision that would haunt his legacy. He refused to disembark. Seeing his men cut down on the beach, he ordered the fleet to turn away. It was a failure of nerve that critics would later point to as proof of his low birth. A true Plantagenet, they argued, would have died on the sand with his sword in hand. The fleet limped away, eventually making for Ireland, the traditional staging ground for Yorkist rebellions. But the English deputy in Ireland was prepared and the ports were barred. Warbeck was running out of safe harbors. France was closed. England was hostile. Ireland was fortified. He needed a new patron, someone reckless enough to gamble on a fading star. He found him in the north. King James IV of Scotland was young, ambitious, and eager to twist the knife in his southern neighbor's side. When Warbeck arrived in Scotland in late 1495, James didn't just offer him asylum, he offered him a future. The Scottish king was arguably the first monarch to treat Warbeck not just as a political tool, but as a human equal. He provided a monthly pension of £1,200, a staggering sum, and gave him the use of Stirling Castle. But James went further, making a move that stunned the diplomatic world. He arranged for Warbeck to marry his own cousin, Lady Catherine Gordon. This was not a clandestine affair, it was a royal wedding, celebrated with tournaments and feasting. By marrying Warbeck into the Scottish royal bloodline, James IV was staking his own dynasty's reputation on the young man's claim. It was an irreversible act of validation. Lady Catherine was a daughter of the Earl of Huntly, a direct descendant of James I of Scotland. This marriage terrified Henry VII more than the mercenaries or the foreign fleets. Armies could be defeated, but bloodlines were persistent. If Warbeck and Catherine had a child, that child would carry the blood of Scottish kings and allegedly the blood of York. It would create a rival dynasty that could plague the Tudors for generations. The insane plot had evolved into an existential crisis. The Pretender was no longer a solitary fraud. He was now a married prince with a powerful army gathering on the northern border, preparing to march south not as an invader, but as a liberator returning home. The stage was set for the most dangerous phase of the conspiracy. The prince had survived assassination attempts, naval disasters, and diplomatic betrayals. He had transformed from a silk merchant's model into a figure who commanded the loyalty of emperors and the hand of aristocrats. But the deception required constant motion to survive. He could not remain a guest forever. He had to be a king, and to be a king, he had to conquer. James IV began to muster the Scottish host. The plan was simple, a massive invasion of northern England. They believed that once the banner of the White Rose was raised on English soil, backed by Scottish steel, the north, always a stronghold of Yorkist sympathy, would defect en masse. Henry Tudor sat in London, checking his ledger books and sharpening his axes, knowing that the final act was approaching. He had silenced the traitors within his own walls, but he could not silence the drums beating in the Scottish Highlands. The collision was inevitable, and this time, Warbeck would not be able to stay on the ship. The Phantom Prince was about to step onto the battlefield. The mist of the Firth of Forth did not just obscure the coastline. It shrouded the arrival of the man who would force Europe to question the very definition of royalty. When Perkin Warbeck stepped onto Scottish soil in November 1495, he was not greeted as a refugee or a curiosity, but with the full, thundering pomp of a visiting monarch. King James IV, a ruler possessed of a Renaissance mind and a medieval sword, did not merely open the gates of Stirling Castle, he opened the veins of his own treasury to fund a ghost. This is where the official narrative often hurries past the details, preferring to paint James as a gullible romantic seduced by a charlatan's tale. But if we look closer at the ledgers and the diplomatic correspondence of the time, a different, far more dangerous reality is exposed. James was a shrewd operator who recognized that a pretender is a nuisance, but a rival king is a weapon of mass destruction. The Scottish court became the stage for Warbeck's greatest performance, yet the evidence suggests he was no longer acting. He was treated with the honors reserved for the Duke of York, addressed as Prince Richard, and given a monthly pension that rivaled the income of the greatest earls in the land. But the most damning piece of evidence against the theory that Warbeck was merely a low-born boatman lies in the marriage arranged for him. James IV offered Warbeck the hand of Lady Catherine Gordon, a woman of royal blood, the daughter of the Earl of Huntly and a cousin to the king himself. This was not a theatrical prop, this was a dynastic binding. In the chess game of 15th century Europe, you do not marry your own blood to a peasant from Tournai to annoy a neighbor. You only make such a match if you believe, or are willing to gamble your kingdom on the belief, that the man standing before you carries the divine right of kings. The wedding of the Phantom Prince and the noblewoman was a spectacle meant to be seen by eyes in London. It was a declaration of war written in silk and gold. For Henry VII, sitting uneasily on his throne in Westminster, this was a nightmare scenario. Pretender in Burgundy was a diplomatic problem. A pretender in Scotland, married to royalty and backed by a border army, was an existential threat. The spies Henry had embedded in the Scottish court began sending back frantic reports. They detailed the gathering of steel, the muster of clans, and the terrifying charisma of the young man they called the Duke of York. If you find value in uncovering these silenced mechanisms of history, in seeing the gears turn behind the official dates and battles, your support helps keep this investigation alive. By September 1496, the talking was over. The invasion that Henry had feared for years finally materialized. The Scottish army, with Warbeck riding under the banner of the White Rose, crossed the border into Northumberland. This was the moment of truth, the test of the exposed narrative. If Warbeck was truly the lost prince, the English people, groaning under Henry's heavy taxes and paranoid governance, should have risen to greet him. The plan relied entirely on a spontaneous uprising. Warbeck had promised James that the moment his foot touched English soil, the North would rally to the House of York. But the North remained silent. The English borderlands were tired. They had bled enough during the Wars of the Roses and had no desire to die for a ghost, no matter how handsome or well-spoken. Instead of a grand procession to London, the invasion devolved into a brutal, scorching raid. The Scottish troops, indifferent to Warbeck's claims and interested only in plunder, began to burn villages and pillage the countryside. This is where the psychological profile of Warbeck fractures the image of the cynical imposter. A con artist would have cheered the destruction, happy to see his enemies bleed. But contemporary accounts describe Warbeck as being devastated by the violence inflicted on his people. He reportedly begged King James to stop the ravaging, crying out that he would rather lose the crown than gain it by the ruin of his subjects. James IV, a warrior king who understood the grim necessities of battle, looked at his weeping ally with a mixture of pity and contempt. He is said to have remarked, "Sir, methinks you take much pain for that which is not yours." It was a cutting observation, one that marked the beginning of the end for their alliance. The invasion stalled. Without local support, and with an English army marching north to meet them, the Scots retreated back across the border. They had tested the waters and found them freezing. The failure of the 1496 invasion did not immediately destroy Warbeck, but it changed the calculus of his survival. He was no longer a rising star, he was a bad investment, and in the halls of power, nothing is more perilous than becoming expensive. Henry VII, displaying the cold genius that defined his reign, realized he did not need to defeat James IV on the battlefield. He could simply buy him. Henry began a diplomatic offensive, offering James a treaty of perpetual peace sealed by the marriage of Henry's own daughter, Margaret Tudor. The offer was dazzling, a union between England and Scotland that would secure James's borders and fill his coffers. There was only one condition: the pretender had to go. For nearly a year, Warbeck lingered in Scotland, watching his support evaporate. The lavish pension was cut, the royal smiles grew tight and forced. He was living in the negative space of history, a man whose utility had expired. The exposed reality here is the terrifying loneliness of a political pawn who is still on the board after the game has ended. He had a wife, a child on the way, and nowhere to run. Europe was closing its doors. France was allied with Henry, Burgundy had signed trade agreements, now Scotland was turning its back. July 1497, the inevitable happened. James IV, preparing to sign the Treaty of Ayton, politely but firmly asked Warbeck to leave. He did not hand him over to Henry, perhaps out of a lingering sense of honor or perhaps because Catherine Gordon was his cousin, but he cast him out. Warbeck was given a ship, the Cuckoo Asterisk, and a small band of die-hard followers. It was a pathetic echo of the Grand Fleet that had once sailed from Flanders. As Warbeck stood on the deck of the Cuckoo Asterisk, watching the Scottish coast recede into the grey horizon, he must have known he was sailing toward his doom. He had exhausted the patience of kings. He had played the role of the prince in the courts of France, Austria, and Scotland, and each time the curtain had fallen. But there was one final act left to play. Rumors were swirling from the southwest of England. The Cornish, fiercely independent and enraged by Henry's taxes, were on the brink of rebellion. They didn't care about the intricacies of the Yorkist lineage, they just wanted a leader to channel their rage against London. Warbeck turned his prow south toward Cornwall. He was no longer the pampered guest of emperors. He was desperate, a man with a price on his head and a target on his back. He was sailing not to claim a crown but to find a grave that fit a king. The exposed truth of this moment is that Warbeck likely knew the imposture, if it was one, was over. He was now fighting for something far more primal, the right to exist in a world that had decided he was a fiction. The Phantom Prince was about to land in the hornet's nest of the Cornish rebellion, where the final, bloody collision between the myth and the man would take place. He would find no palaces there, only desperate men with rusted weapons looking for a savior, and he would give them one until the very end. Whitesand Bay was not the grand stage a returning monarch would choose, but history rarely offers the exiled the luxury of aesthetics. When Perkin Warbeck stepped onto the Cornish sand in September 1497, the polished veneer of the European courts was instantly stripped away, exposing the raw, mechanical reality of insurrection. The official chronicles often paint this moment as the delusion of a madman leading the blind, but a closer examination of the rebellion reveals a far more pragmatic and dangerous truth. The Cornish were not merely duped peasants following a pretty face. They were a politically marginalized people, crushed by Henry VII's taxation, looking for a weapon to wield against London. Warbeck was simply the most convenient weapon available. He did not have to convince them of his lineage so much as he had to convince them of his utility. Within hours, 3,000 men had gathered under his banner. They were tin miners, farmers, and smiths, men with callous hands and legitimate grievances, armed not with the steel of knights but with billhooks, rusty swords, and bows. Here, the pretender made his final and most audacious transition. He ceased to be the exotic guest of foreign kings and declared himself Richard IV, King of England and Lord of Ireland. It was a title shouted into the wind on a desolate coast, yet it carried enough weight to compel thousands to march. But this was no longer a game of diplomatic chess played in the palaces of Burgundy. This was a kinetic war, and the White Rose was about to be tested against the brutal physics of a siege. The target was Exeter. If Warbeck could take a major city, the legitimacy he had pantomimed for 6 years might finally solidify into fact. But Exeter was a fortress of loyalists, and its citizens were terrified of the rough Cornish army gathering at their walls. When the assault began, the limitations of Warbeck's royal education became painfully obvious. A prince is taught to command, but a general must know how to break stone. Warbeck had no artillery, no siege engines, and no engineers. His army fought with a desperate, frantic energy, burning the city gates and attempting to storm the breaches through sheer weight of numbers. The fighting was savage. The Cornishmen, driven by the promise of lower taxes and the overthrow of a tyrant, threw themselves against the defenses. Warbeck was reportedly seen in the thick of it, urging them on, a moment where the actor perhaps finally believed his own role. But belief does not shatter stone walls. The citizens of Exeter, fearing plunder, fought back with equal ferocity, and the lack of heavy guns doomed the assault. After suffering heavy casualties, the pretender was forced to withdraw. The psychological toll of this failure was immediate. He had promised victory and delivered only death. The illusion of divine favor, so essential to a usurper's narrative, began to fracture. He retreated toward Taunton, his army now swelling to nearly 6,000 men despite the defeat, a testament to the sheer hatred the region held for Henry Tudor. But numbers alone are deceptive. While Warbeck had a mob, Henry VII had a machine. The king's forces, led by the seasoned Giles Daubeny, were marching west with the precision of a professional army. They brought with them the heavy artillery Warbeck lacked, and the disciplined cavalry that could cut down a peasant militia in minutes. It is here, in the shadow of the approaching royal army, that we see the most telling glimpse into Warbeck's mind. The narrative of the brave prince returning for his birthright dissolves, leaving behind a terrified young man realizing he has walked into a trap of his own making. The scouts reported the king's advance. The reality of the coming slaughter set in. Warbeck knew that while his Cornish followers might be granted mercy as misguided subjects, he, the head of the serpent, would face the full agony of a traitor's death. If you are fascinated by how historical narratives are often constructed to hide the terrified humanity of their subjects, subscribing ensures you won't miss the future investigations into these erased timelines. On the night of September 21st, 1497, the king made his choice. He did not address his troops. He did not devise a final strategy. Under the cover of darkness, with the silent efficiency of a thief, Perkin Warbeck mounted a horse and fled. He abandoned 6,000 men who were prepared to die for him. He left them sleeping in their camp, believing their savior was resting in his tent, only to wake up to a leaderless dawn and the king's cavalry on the horizon. This betrayal is the smoking gun that historians point to when dismantling his claim. A true Plantagenet, they argue, would have died on the field. Warbeck chose survival. He rode hard for the sanctuary of Beaulieu Abbey in the New Forest, hoping the holy ground would shield him from Henry's wrath. But Henry VII was not a man to respect boundaries when the stability of his realm was at stake. His men surrounded the abbey. There would be no siege, only a suffocation. Warbeck was trapped, cut off from the world, with the king's agents offering the only thing left to bargain with his life. If he surrendered, if he ended the charade, he would be spared. The surrender that followed was total. The young man who walked out of Beaulieu Abbey was a ghost of the figure who had charmed the courts of Europe. He was brought before Henry VII at Taunton, not as a rival monarch, but as a curiosity. The meeting between the two is one of history's great anticlimaxes. There was no duel, no shouting match. Henry, ever the cold pragmatist, did not execute him immediately. He knew that a dead martyr could be more dangerous than a living fool. Instead, Henry needed to destroy the asterisk idea of Richard IV. He needed a confession so comprehensive, so humiliating, that it would inoculate England against Yorkist pretenders forever. This brings us to the most controversial document in the Warbeck file, the confession. Under interrogation, the details of which remain ominously vague in the official records, Warbeck provided a full account of his life. He stated he was born within the town of Tournai, the son of a boatman named John Osbeck. He detailed his travels, the names of his family, and the specific circumstances of how he was taught to act like a prince. Critics and conspiracy theorists have long argued that this confession was fabricated or coerced under the threat of torture. They point out that the details fit Henry's political needs a little too perfectly. However, the sheer banality of the confession lends it a certain credibility. It wasn't a grand tale of stolen birthrights. It was a mundane story of a boy with a talent for mimicry who got in over his head. He described how his silk clothes led people to mistake him for nobility, and how, seduced by their attention, he simply never corrected them. Henry VII, satisfied that he had broken the man, decided to parade his prize. Warbeck was not thrown into a dungeon initially. Instead, he was kept as a sort of court pet, a living trophy of the Tudor triumph. He was forced to travel with the king back to London, displayed to the crowds not as a monster, but as a fraud. The psychological dismantling was methodical. The people who had once whispered his name and now jeered at the boatman's son. But the final act of this tragedy had not yet been written. Warbeck was alive, yes, but he was a loose thread in a tapestry Henry was desperately trying to weave into a solid dynasty. As they arrived in London, the capital was buzzing. The prince was in the city, and despite the confession, despite the humiliation, there were still those in the shadows who looked at him and saw the face of the old king. Henry had captured the body of Perkin Warbeck, but he had not yet successfully killed the ghost. The leniency Henry displayed, allowing Warbeck to live at court under guard but relatively comfortable, was a calculated risk. It was a test, and as the months dragged on, the isolation of his gilded cage began to weigh on Warbeck. He was a prisoner in the very palaces he had claimed were his birthright, surrounded by courtiers who mocked him. The pressure was building, and a man who has successfully escaped once will always dream of doing it again. We are told that Perkin Warbeck was a delusional pretender who foolishly tried to flee a benevolent king. That is the comfortable narrative found in the official chronicles. But if you examine the security protocols of a Tudor court, a different, darker picture emerges. A prisoner of state, the single greatest threat to the dynasty, does not simply slip through the fingers of the most paranoid monarch in Europe unless the fingers were deliberately opened. This wasn't just an escape attempt, it was the beginning of a meticulously staged endgame. Henry VII was done playing the benevolent father figure. He needed a reason to tighten the noose, and history suggests he may have quietly encouraged Warbeck to provide one. On June 9, 1498, the inevitable fracture occurs. Warbeck slips away from the king's retinue. It is a desperate, uncoordinated flight. He does not head for the coast to rally an army. He does not have a network of spies waiting to whisk him to Burgundy. He runs like a frightened animal. He manages to put a few miles between himself and the court, but the reality of his situation crashes down on him almost immediately. He is a man with a face known to every magistrate in England, speaking with an accent that betrays him, wearing clothes that mark him as an outsider. There is nowhere to go. By nightfall, the adrenaline fades, replaced by the cold certainty of capture. He flees to the Carthusian monastery at Sheen, known today as Richmond. He does not demand sanctuary as a king, he begs for it as a fugitive. He throws himself at the mercy of the prior, pleading for his life. The prior, a man of God caught in a web of kings, goes to Henry VII and negotiates a deal. Warbeck's life will be spared if he surrenders. Henry agrees. But the definition of life is subject to royal interpretation. The man who walks out of that monastery is no longer treated as a misguided noble. The velvet gloves are removed and the iron gauntlet is revealed. Henry VII decides that if Warbeck cannot be a quiet prisoner, he must be a public spectacle. The pretender is dragged back to London, but not to the palace. On June 15, a wooden structure is erected in Westminster Hall. It is a set of stocks. For a man who claimed to be Richard, Duke of York, the rightful King of England, this is a degradation worse than death. He is locked into the timber frame, his face exposed to the jeers and rotten vegetables of the London mob. He is forced to sit there hour after hour, a living monument to failed ambition. But the physical humiliation is only the preamble. The true punishment is the destruction of his identity. Henry commands that Warbeck publicly read his confession, the same document he signed months prior, detailing his origins as a boatman's son from Tournai. He has to shout it to the crowd. I was born at Tournai in Flanders. My father's name is John Osbeck. He has to dismantle his own myth, sentence by sentence, while the common people who once might have whispered his name in hope, now howl with laughter. He repeats this performance at Cheapside the following day. By the time he is taken down from the stocks, the White Rose of York has been trampled into the mud. This is where the narrative shifts from political drama to Gothic tragedy. The king decides that the gilded cage is no longer sufficient. Warbeck is transferred to the Tower of London. This is not the comfortable house arrest of the court. This is the Cold Harbor Tower, damp, dark, and smelling of the river and stone. He is thrown into a cell that is designed to break the human spirit. The light is dim, the food is scarce, and the solitude is crushing. However, Warbeck is not entirely alone, and this is where the genius or the cruelty of Henry VII becomes most apparent. In the cell directly adjacent to Warbeck, or perhaps in the one beneath him, lies another prisoner. This is not a pretender. This is Edward Plantagenet, the Earl of Warwick. If Warbeck is the false claimant, Warwick is the dangerous reality. He is the nephew of two kings, the last surviving male of the House of York. He has been a prisoner since he was 10 years old. Now 24, he is a man-child, stunted by isolation, naive to the point of simplicity, having spent his entire conscious life within stone walls. He knows nothing of the world, nothing of politics, and yet his blood is the most valuable substance in England. Two ghosts of the Yorkist dynasty are now separated by a few feet of masonry. It is inevitable that they will find each other. Through a gap in the floorboards or perhaps a loosened stone in the wall, they begin to talk. It is a conversation born of desperation. Warbeck, the man who pretended to be a prince, and Warwick, the prince who was treated like a criminal. They trade stories. Warbeck, worldly and charismatic even in defeat, likely dazzles the innocent Warwick with tales of the courts of Europe, of battles, of Duchess Margaret. Warwick, lonely and starving for connection, listens. They begin to plot, or at least they begin to dream. The plan they concoct is fantastical, the kind of scheme two desperate men whisper in the dark. They speak of overpowering the lieutenant of the tower. They speak of seizing the keys, releasing the other prisoners, and igniting a rebellion that will sweep them both to power. It is a plan with zero chance of success, a delusion fueled by the hopelessness of their confinement. But they are not whispering into a void, they are whispering into a microphone. Historical analysis strongly suggests that their communication was not a security breach, but a security feature. The guards who allowed them to talk, the hole in the wall that conveniently existed, the messages that were passed between them, it all bears the signature of a sting operation. Henry VII was under immense pressure from abroad. The Spanish monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, were negotiating the marriage of their daughter, Catherine of Aragon, to Henry's son Arthur, but they were hesitant. They famously wrote that they would not send their daughter to a kingdom full of thorns. They needed assurance that the Tudor throne was secure, that there were no rival claimants who could plunge England back into civil war. Henry needed to clear the board. He couldn't execute Warwick for the crime of being born, and he had promised to spare Warbeck's life. He needed a new crime. He needed treason committed within the tower. If you appreciate the effort it takes to piece together these fragmented timelines and silenced voices, subscribing helps us continue this investigation into history's erased dynasties. The archives are vast, and your support ensures we can keep bringing these hidden narratives to light. As the summer of 1499 turns to autumn, the trap snaps shut. The conversations between Warbeck and Warwick are meticulously documented by a third party, a man named Robert Claymont, likely an agent provocateur planted by the king. Claymont encourages their delusions, feeds their hopes, and ensures that every treasonous word is recorded. He validates their escape plan, perhaps even suggesting the details, ensuring that the evidence against them is irrefutable. In November, the guards descend. There is no battle, no daring escape attempt, just the heavy sound of boots on stone and the turning of keys. Warbeck and Warwick are separated, dragged from their cells, and confronted with the dossier of their own words. The plot to seize the tower is revealed. For Warwick, it is a confusing nightmare. He likely barely understood that his conversations were crimes. For Warbeck, it is the final realization that he has been outmaneuvered by a master strategist. The legal machinery moves with terrifying speed. This time there will be no mercy, no confession tour, no stocks. The time for theater is over. The king needs bodies. Warbeck is condemned not for his original impersonation, which had been forgiven, but for this new treason committed on English soil. He is sentenced to hang. November 23, 1499, Perkin Warbeck is led out of the tower for the last time. He is taken to Tyburn, the notorious execution site known as the Tyburn Tree. The crowds are massive. They have come to see the end of the man who haunted their king for nearly a decade. But as he stands on the scaffold, the man who charmed emperors and duchesses is gone. In his place is a broken figure, ready to play his final role in Henry's script. He does not scream defiance. He does not claim to be Richard IV. He asks the king's forgiveness, and he asks God's mercy. The rope tightens, the trap falls. The white rose is extinguished. But the true tragedy happens 5 days later. The innocent Earl of Warwick, whose only crime was his lineage, is led to Tower Hill. Because of his noble blood, he is granted the privilege of beheading rather than hanging. He dies bewildered, a victim of a dynastic housekeeping operation. With these two deaths, Henry VII finally severs the roots of the Plantagenet tree. The thorns are cleared. The Spanish marriage can proceed. Warbeck's journey from the docks of Tournai to the gallows of Tyburn was over. He had shaken the foundations of Europe, cost the English treasury millions, and forced a king to live in fear for years. But as the crowd dispersed and the body was cut down, the question remained, a question that still lingers in the silence of the archives. Was he truly just a boatman's son who acted the part too well? Or was there something more, some fragment of truth that had to be strangled alongside him? Even in death, Warbeck refused to disappear completely. The official story was sealed, but whispers persisted. And as we look back, we have to ask, who is the real architect of this drama? The boy who wanted to be king, or the king who needed a monster to slay? The end of Warbeck was the beginning of the Tudor absolute power, but the ghost of the princes in the tower was not laid to rest. It was merely buried under a fresh layer of official ink. The ink on the official confession was barely dry before copies were dispatched to every court in Europe. It was a masterclass in bureaucratic erasure. We are told the confession was voluntary, a final unburdening of a guilty soul before meeting its maker. We are told the boy was definitively identified as a boatman's son from Tournai, a commoner who had flown too close to the sun. But when you strip away the Tudor seal and look at the timeline of that document, a different pattern emerges, one of careful, almost desperate construction. The narrative was too perfect, the details too convenient. It suggests that the execution at Tyburn was not just about ending a life, but about cementing a specific version of reality that Henry VII needed the world to believe. The death of Perkin Warbeck was only the first act of this final tragedy. To truly understand the scope of what Henry was doing, we have to look at the man who died just days later. Edward, Earl of Warwick. He was the innocent nephew of two kings, a boy who had spent his entire life locked away in the Tower of London simply because his last name was Plantagenet. He had never plotted, never raised an army, never claimed a throne. His only crime was his bloodline. Yet Henry found a way to link him to Warbeck's alleged escape attempt. It was a flimsy pretext, a transparent fabrication that allowed the king to legally murder the last legitimate male contender to his crown. This is where the mask of the just king slips, revealing the cold pragmatism underneath. The execution of Warbeck was political housekeeping. The execution of Warwick was a judicial massacre. Historians have long debated the timing, but the evidence points to a pressure far greater than domestic rebellion. The pressure came from Spain. Henry was desperate to secure the marriage between his son Arthur and Catherine of Aragon, the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella. The Spanish monarchs, shrewd and ruthless in their own right, had made their condition clear. They would not send their daughter to a kingdom unstable with rival claimants. They demanded a clean slate. In essence, the blood of Warbeck and Warwick was the dowry paid to bringing the Spanish princess to England. If you are fascinated by how these hidden diplomatic pressures reshape the narratives we are taught in school, subscribing helps us continue to excavate these buried layers of history. The sheer efficiency with which Henry dismantled the threat is terrifying. With 2 strokes of the axe, he eliminated the impostor who had haunted his dreams and the cousin who had haunted his legitimacy. But the ghost of the prince refused to vanish entirely. The confession attributed to Warbeck, which was read aloud and distributed like a royal proclamation, contains oddities that forensic historians have picked apart for centuries. It is filled with specific names of family members in Tournai, details of his childhood, and the exact trajectory of his travels. On the surface, it is comprehensive. Under the microscope, it feels scripted. Why would a man about to die memorize such a complex genealogy of a peasant family unless he was being coached? The confession reads less like the memories of a dying man and more like a dossier prepared by a royal intelligence network. It answered every question the public might have, closed every loophole, and absolved the king of any doubt. It was, in modern terms, a press release issued at the gallows. This document became the bedrock of the Tudor history books, the primary source for everything we think we know about Perkin Warbeck. But we must remember that history is written by the survivors, and in 1499, the only survivor was Henry Tudor. The psychological toll of this decade-long charade on the king cannot be overstated. Henry VII is often remembered as a miserly, boring accountant king, obsessed with ledgers and taxes. But this conflict reveals him as a man besieged by paranoia, constantly looking over his shoulder for the next ghost. Warbeck had forced Henry to construct a surveillance state. The king employed a network of spies, ciphers, and informants that stretched across the continent. He bribed courtiers in Burgundy, intercepted letters in Scotland, and turned the nobility of England against one another in a hunt for traitors. This was the birth of the modern intelligence apparatus, forged in the fire of the Warbeck conspiracy. The pretender had exposed the fragility of the Tudor claim. Even after the bodies were buried, the fear remained. Henry became increasingly reclusive, his court more insular. The open, chivalric atmosphere of the early reign gave way to a dark, suspicious twilight. He had won, but the victory had cost him his peace of mind. He had been forced to execute a man who might have been the true king and a boy who was certainly innocent. These were sins that no amount of gold could wash away, and they set a grim precedent for his son, Henry VII, who would later wield the axe with far less hesitation. It is also critical to examine the reaction of the European powers. For years, Maximilian regarding the Holy Roman Empire, James IV of Scotland, and Margaret of Burgundy had treated Warbeck as a prince. Did they truly believe it, or was he simply a convenient pawn on the geopolitical chessboard? The speed with which they abandoned him once his utility expired suggests the latter. When Warbeck was captured, the letters of support evaporated. The courts of Europe suffered a collective amnesia. It was as if the Duke of York had never existed. This collective silence is perhaps the most damning evidence of all. It reveals that in the game of empires, truth is irrelevant. Warbeck was a weapon to be used against England, and when the weapon broke, it was discarded. However, the common people of England did not forget so easily. For them, Warbeck had been a figure of romance and possibility. He was the lost prince returning to save them from taxes and tyranny. Even after the confession was published, whispers persisted in the alehouses and market squares. They said the man executed at Tyburn was a double. They said the confession was forged. They said the real prince had escaped again. These rumors were baseless, but they speak to a profound distrust of the official narrative. The people knew they were being managed. They sensed the artificiality of the king's justice. This skepticism is what makes the Warbeck saga so enduring. It is a story with a hole in the center, a void where the identity of the protagonist should be. We have the Tudor version, the boatman's son. We have the Yorkist version, the lost prince. And somewhere in the silence between them lies the truth. Did Warbeck himself know who he was by the end? After years of being addressed as Your Grace, of wearing silk and dining with kings, did the mask fuse to the face? There's a tragic possibility that Warbeck, regardless of his origins, died believing in his own myth. The psychological conditioning he underwent, first by his handlers in Ireland and France, then by Margaret of Burgundy, was intense. He was taught to walk, speak, and think like a king. He was surrounded by people who reinforced his delusion every hour of every day. By the time he stood on the scaffold, the line between Perkin Warbeck and Richard of York may have been erased in his own mind. He was a victim of a grand deception, but he was also its primary subject. The elimination of Warbeck cleared the way for the Tudor Golden Age, but the foundations were stained. The dynasty that would produce Elizabeth I and the English Renaissance was built on a graveyard of rival claimants. Henry VII's ruthlessness in 1499 signaled to the world that the Wars of the Roses were definitively over, not because peace had been achieved, but because there was no one left to fight. The opposition had been systematically exterminated. Yet the questions linger. If Warbeck was truly a nobody, a random commoner with a passing resemblance to Edward IV, how did he sustain the charade for so long? How did he fool the aunt of the real prince? How did he command the loyalty of hardened soldiers and seasoned diplomats? The official history asks us to believe in a coincidence of monumental proportions, that a boatman's son possessed the innate charisma and intellect to shake the foundations of Europe. It is a convenient explanation, but it is not a satisfying one. It requires us to suspend our disbelief and accept that a peasant could flawlessly inhabit the skin of a prince for nearly a decade without slipping. As we move forward to examine the legacy of this plot, we must carry this skepticism with us. The execution was the end of the man, but the beginning of the mystery. The Tudors wanted us to close the book in 1499. They wanted the file stamped closed. But history is rarely that obedient. The loose ends that Henry tried to cut away kept fraying. The ghost of the princes in the tower did not stay in the tower. It seeped into the very stonework of the Tudor monarchy, a silent reminder that power is often purchased with lies. The story of Perkin Warbeck forces us to ask, how much of our history is fact and how much is merely the successful propaganda of the winning side? But the official narrative asks us to accept a convenient simplicity that the evidence simply does not support. We are told that Perkin Warbeck was merely a fraud who was caught, confessed, and punished. Yet when you examine the timeline of his capture and the specific mechanisms Henry VII employed to neutralize him, a different picture emerges, one of careful, theatrical dismantling rather than simple justice. The king did not want a martyr, he wanted a laughingstock. To kill Warbeck immediately would have been to immortalize him as a lost prince, a ghost that would haunt the Tudor line forever. Henry needed to hollow out the man before he destroyed the body, and the method he chose reveals a chilling sophistication in the art of psychological warfare. Upon his surrender at Beaulieu Abbey, Warbeck was not thrown into a dungeon to rot. Instead, he was brought face to face with the man he had tried to dethrone. The meeting took place at Taunton, and by all accounts, Henry VII treated the pretender with an eerie, calculated leniency. There was no immediate execution, no public drawing and quartering. Henry, the master accountant of kings, realized that Warbeck was more valuable as a living prop than as a corpse. He forced Warbeck to travel with the royal court, not in chains, but under a suffocating, constant surveillance. He was paraded through the streets of London, displayed like an exotic animal brought back from a distant conquest. The crowds that had once whispered about the return of the White Rose were now invited to jeer at the painted prince, a man stripped of his silk and steel, reduced to a curiosity. This was the prelude to the most damaging weapon in Henry's arsenal, the confession. A document was produced, allegedly dictated by Warbeck himself, which laid out in excruciating detail his true origins. It claimed he was born Perkin Warbeck in Tournai, the son of a boatman and a supervisor of tolls. It named his grandfathers, his uncles, and the specific masters he had served as a servant boy. It explained how his fine clothes and regal bearing were merely the result of being a mannequin for a silk merchant, a boy who looked the part and was taught to act it. The specificity of the confession has always been cited by historians as proof of its authenticity. After all, why invent such mundane details? However, in the context of statecraft, specificity is often the hallmark of a well-crafted fabrication. The confession was distributed widely, read aloud in town squares, and sent to foreign courts. It was a masterstroke of propaganda designed to humiliate Warbeck's supporters. If you look closely at the language, it reads less like the unburdening of a guilty conscience and more like a legal deposition drafted by royal counselors. It tied up every loose end, explained away every anomaly, and absolved the king of any doubt. It was too perfect. Whether Warbeck was truly a boatman's son or a prince forced to recite a script to save his life, and perhaps the life of his wife, Lady Catherine Gordon, is a distinction that vanished the moment the ink dried. Life as a captive in Henry's court was a gilded cage designed to break the spirit. Warbeck was allowed to live in the palace, but he was never alone. Every conversation was monitored, every movement was tracked. He was forced to endure the pity of the courtiers and the silent scrutiny of the king. His wife, the noble Catherine Gordon, whom Henry had dubbed the White Rose of Scotland, was absorbed into the Queen's household. Henry treated her with honor, perhaps to emphasize his own chivalry, or perhaps to keep another potential figurehead under his thumb. For 18 months, Warbeck existed in this limbo, a living ghost haunting the corridors of power, a constant reminder of the fragility of the Tudor claim. But a man who has tasted royal acclaim, even if it was illusory, cannot live as a pet forever. In June 1498, the psychological pressure finally caused a fracture. Warbeck escaped. It was a desperate, ill-planned flight. He slipped away from his guards and made a run for the coast, hoping perhaps to find a ship, to find a friend, to find anywhere but the suffocating gaze of Henry Tudor. He didn't get far. He was captured at the monastery of Sheen, found cowering and broken. This time, the king's patience, or the performance of it, had run its course. The mask of benevolence slipped. Warbeck was dragged back to London, but the days of courtly humiliation were over. He was shackled, placed in the stocks at Westminster and Cheapside, and forced to read his confession aloud to the mob while they hurled abuse and filth at him. This was the ritual degradation of the idol. Henry was systematically stripping away the divine aura Warbeck had cultivated, reducing him to a common criminal in the eyes of the people. Following this public shaming, he was thrown into the Tower of London. It is here, in the damp stone silence of the tower, that the story shifts from a political drama to a dark forensic tragedy. Henry VII had a problem that went deeper than Perkin Warbeck. In the tower sat another prisoner, a man who had been there for nearly his entire life, Edward Plantagenet, the Earl of Warwick. Warwick was the nephew of two kings, Edward IV and Richard III. Unlike Warbeck, whose lineage was debated, Warwick's blood was undeniably royal. He was the last direct male survivor of the Plantagenet line. He had committed no crime other than being born, yet Henry had kept him locked away since he was 10 years old. By 1499, Warwick was 24, but reports suggest he was naive, unworldly, perhaps even mentally stunted by his long isolation. He was the true threat, the legitimate claimant that Warbeck had merely pantomimed. By placing Warbeck in the tower, Henry created a volatile mixture. He placed the pretender and the true prince in close proximity. If you scrutinize the events that followed, it becomes difficult to see them as accidental. This was the year 1499, and Henry was negotiating the marriage of his son Arthur to Catherine of Aragon. The Spanish monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, were ruthless pragmatists. They sent word that they would not send their daughter to a kingdom where the throne was unstable, where rival claimants still drew breath. They demanded a clean slate. Henry needed a reason to clear the board. What happened next has all the hallmarks of a state-sponsored entrapment operation. We are told that Warbeck and Warwick, communicating through cracks in the floor or bribed guards, hatched a plot. The official story is that they planned to kill the lieutenant of the tower, seize the keys, steal the royal treasury, and spark a new rebellion. It is an absurd proposition, a broken pretender and a simple-minded recluse, organizing a coup from inside the most secure fortress in England. If unraveling these centuries-old webs of surveillance and statecraft aligns with your interests, your support ensures we can continue excavating these forgotten chapters. The plot was discovered almost immediately, largely because the agents facilitating it were likely working for the king all along. It provided exactly what Henry needed, a legal pretext to execute not just the nuisance Warbeck, but the dangerous Earl of Warwick. The timing is simply too convenient to be coincidental. The Spanish pressure, the sudden transfer of Warbeck to Warwick's vicinity, and the rapid discovery of a treasonous conspiracy suggest that the entire affair was engineered. Warbeck was the bait, and Warwick was the target. In November 1499, the trap snapped shut. Warbeck was tried at Westminster. He was no longer the dashing prince invading from the sea. He was a broken man, a pawn in a game he had ceased to understand. He was condemned not for his invasion, but for this new, desperate conspiracy within the tower. The judgment was inevitable. The machinery of the Tudor state had finished its work. They had used Warbeck to reveal the disloyalty of the nobles, then used him to entrap the last Plantagenet, and now, having extracted every ounce of utility from him, they prepared to discard the husk. The journey of Perkin Warbeck from the courts of Europe to the scaffold at Tyburn was nearing its end. But as the day of execution approached, the question remained, who was dying? Was it the boatman's son from Tournai finally paying for his fraud? Or was it a man who had been so thoroughly rewritten by his enemies that his true identity had been erased long before his death? The state had controlled his life, his image, and his words. Now they would control his ending. We are told that on the scaffold he confessed everything freely. We are told he admitted to being a boatman's son, a fraud, and a manipulator who had deceived the courts of Europe. But when you look at the precision of that confession, the way it perfectly aligned with every political necessity of the Tudor state, you have to ask, was this the truth, or was it the final script placed in the hands of a dying actor? The official narrative requires us to believe that Perkin Warbeck simply gave up, that the weight of his guilt finally broke him. Yet the timing suggests something far more calculated. He was not executed when he was captured. He was not executed when he tried to run. He was executed only when his death could serve a dual purpose, to erase a rival and to murder a legitimate prince by association. On November 23, 1499, the man who had called himself Richard of York was led out to Tyburn. This was not the dignified exit of a fallen noble. There was no block, no axe, and no privacy. Tyburn was the destination for common criminals, a place of mud, noise, and shame. This was Henry VI's final piece of stagecraft. By hanging Warbeck like a thief rather than beheading him like a traitor, the king was making a visual argument to the thousands watching. He was saying, look at him, this is not a prince. Princes bleed, peasants swing. Warbeck was dragged on a hurdle through the streets of London. The crowds that had once whispered his name in awe, wondering if the lost Prince of York had returned to save them, now jeered or stood in confused silence. It is difficult to imagine the internal state of a man who has played a role so completely that the line between the mask and the face has dissolved. Did he still believe in those final moments that he was the rightful king of England? Or had the months of darkness in the tower, the beatings, and the psychological deconstruction finally convinced him that he was indeed just a boy from Tournai? He climbed the ladder. The rope was placed around his neck. Even then, the script had to be followed. He read his confession to the crowd, a document that had been drafted, redrafted, and approved by the king's council. He blamed the Duchess of Burgundy. He blamed the King of France. He blamed everyone but himself, painting himself as a naive vessel used by powerful men. It was a political masterstroke, absolving the English rebels of genuine treason by claiming they had been tricked by a foreign plot. Then the latter was turned. The man who had dined with emperors, who had married a cousin of the King of Scotland, and who had invaded England 3 times, was left to dance on the air until he was still. But the tragedy did not end with the swinging rope at Tyburn. The true horror of this final act took place days later on Tower Hill. The Earl of Warwick, the innocent Edward Plantagenet, who had spent his entire life in a cell simply for having a better claim to the throne than Henry Tudor, was led out to the block. Unlike Warbeck, Warwick was granted the mercy of the axe because his royal blood was undeniable. His death was the true objective of the entire affair. Warbeck had been the bait and Warwick had been the prey. With both men dead, the House of York was effectively extinct. The path was finally clear. This double execution was not just about domestic security, it was a geopolitical transaction. Across the sea, the Spanish monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella had been watching closely. They had refused to send their daughter, Catherine of Aragon, to marry Henry's son, Arthur, as long as pretenders threatened the English throne. They would not invest their blood and gold into a dynasty that might be toppled by a ghost from the past. By killing Warbeck and Warwick, Henry VII was sending a message to Spain: the past is dead, the future is secure, send the girl. If unraveling these layers of statecraft and forgotten lineages intrigues you, subscribing ensures you won't miss the next investigation into the archives of the unknown. The marriage treaty was finalized almost immediately. The Tudor dynasty, built on shaky foundations and haunted by the specter of the princes in the tower, had finally purchased its legitimacy with blood. But the ghost of Perkin Warbeck proved difficult to exorcise. Even after his body was cut down and buried in an obscure grave at Austin Friars, the questions remained. Why did Henry VII work so hard to prove Warbeck was a fraud? If he was truly just a boatman's son, why the elaborate treaties, the trade embargoes that nearly bankrupted England, and the years of obsession? Kings do not bargain with emperors over the fate of a peasant. The sheer scale of the reaction suggests that, regardless of his DNA, Warbeck possessed something that terrified the Tudor state: the power of belief. He reminded the world that a king is only a king because people agree to pretend he is. Warbeck had exposed the fragility of the monarchy by showing that with enough silk, enough gold, and enough confidence, anyone could wear the crown. History is written by the victors, and the Tudors were the ultimate victors. They commissioned historians to write the definitive accounts of the era, ensuring that Warbeck would forever be remembered as a duped boy or a foolish impostor. They crafted the narrative of the Tudor myth, portraying the Wars of the Roses as a chaotic dark age that was saved by the righteous arrival of Henry VII. In this story, Warbeck had to be a villain, or at least a pathetic joke. He could not be allowed to be a tragic hero, and he certainly could not be allowed to be Richard of York. Yet forensic historians and modern analysts continue to pick at the scabs of this story. There are inconsistencies in the confession, details about his family in Tournai that don't quite match the archival records in Flanders. There's the strange behavior of his aunt, Margaret of Burgundy, who mourned him as a son until her dying day. Would a woman of her standing, the sister of 2 kings, really have debased herself for a low-born fraud for so long? Or did she know something that the history books erased? We will likely never know the absolute truth. The DNA is gone, the bones are lost, and the papers were burned or forged centuries ago. But in a way, the biological truth matters less than the political reality. Perkin Warbeck was the last white rose. He was the final flicker of the Plantagenet dream, a dream that favored medieval chivalry and blood right over the cold, administrative efficiency of the coming Tudor age. When he died, the Middle Ages in England began to die with him. The era of romantic claimants and knights rising under banners was ending. It was being replaced by an era of spies, ciphers, diplomatic marriages, and state-sanctioned executions. Henry VII didn't just kill a rival. He killed the idea that the crown belonged to the one with the best story. He established that the crown belonged to the one who could hold it by any means necessary. So, as we look back at the young man who walked out of the mist in Ireland and claimed to be a king, we see more than just an imposter. We see a mirror reflecting the insecurities of a usurper. We see a boy who was used by every major power in Europe as a poker chip in a high-stakes game, only to be discarded when the hand was played. Perkin Warbeck may have been a boatman's son named Pirathan, or he may have been Richard, Duke of York. But in the end, he became exactly what he claimed to be: a prince. He lived like one, he fought like one, and he died because he was too dangerous to be allowed to live. In the ruthless calculus of history, that is the only definition of royalty that matters. The pretender was dead, the king was secure, and the truth was buried so deep that 500 years later we are still digging.